Hi there, nice to meet you again. Oh, hey there, David. Nice to see you. What am I going to learn today? Today, you are going to learn all about gastrointestinal agents. We can divide the word gastrointestinal into two parts, gastro and intestinal. Gastro relates to the stomach and intestinal relates to the intestines. Gastrointestinal agents form a broad range of drugs used to treat stomach/intestinal related symptoms. I'll be discussing four different classes of gastrointestinal agents, namely laxatives, anti-diarrheals, antiemetics, and antacids. Okay, let's start with laxatives first. When describing how laxatives work, we can classify them into four groups based on how they function. What are the four groups? Well, they are osmotic laxatives, stimulant laxatives, bulking laxatives, and stool softeners. An example of an osmotic laxative is lactulose. An example of a stimulant laxative is bisacodyl. An example of a bulking laxative would be fibogel, and an example of a stool softener is docusate sodium. Right, perhaps we dive into osmotic laxatives now? Sure, David. You should be aware of the root word for osmotic laxatives. The root word is osmosis. Do you happen to know what osmosis is? Not really. Well, basically, osmosis is the net movement of water particles from an area of higher water potential, almost like concentration of water, to an area of lower water potential. Now, osmotic laxatives increase the osmotic pressure in the intestines, which allows for less fluids being reabsorbed in the large intestine, basically adding more fluids to stool. Examples of this include magnesium carbonate, magnesium hydroxide, and sodium sulfate. Right. Now let's move on to stimulant laxatives. Well, it stimulates the intestines, right? Yes. The name itself gives it away, but I'll give you a more specific explanation than it stimulates the intestines. So how do they work? How do they stimulate the intestines? Well, stimulates comes from the word stimulus, which we know in the body is usually caused by the nervous system detecting something, which is a stimulus. Stimulus laxatives work by stimulating nerve endings in colon tissues to increase the motility of stool in the intestines, which increases your bowel movement. An example of this would be bisacodyl. Nice explanation, Dr. Jen. You're welcome, David. Now, what do you know about bulking laxatives? Hint, the name gives it away again. Well, I think it adds bulk or weight to it, right? Isn't this like fiber? You're right, David. It adds weight or bulk to stool. Bulking laxatives are often found in foods high in fiber. An example of a bulking laxative would be Isophaluga husk. Pretty straightforward, yes. Lastly, let's now talk about stool softeners. I guess the name of it really does give it away, isn't it, right? Yes. I guess so. It basically makes stool softer, right? That's an unscientific way to put it, but basically that's what it is, really. The scientific explanation is that stool softeners decrease the surface tension of stool, making it easier to push out of the anus. An example of this would be docusate sodium. Yup. Now let me talk you through another class of gastrointestinal agents. Let's talk about anti-diarrheals. Okay, I guess. Good. The name's pretty straightforward. It basically means a group of drugs that treat diarrhea or watery stool. To add on to this, diarrhea treatment should include fluid rehydration therapy that includes fluid and electrolytes such as salts, as diarrhea can cause dehydration. I'll take note of that. Now, can you give me an example of an anti-diarrheal? Sure, loperamide. Okay, so how does it work? I'm guessing it's sort of like the reverse of a laxative. To a certain extent, you are correct. Instead of increasing bowel movements like stimulant laxatives, loperamide inhibits bowel movements. This property is attributed to loperamide being a synthetic analog of opioid agents, though this does not mean it is an opioid. Great explanation. Now, what precautions and side effects should be taken when prescribing or taking loperamide? Let's start with precautions first. Those with liver failure or impairment should take loperamide with precaution. Caution should be observed for those with IBS, or which we know as irritable bowel syndrome, for its side effects, and they generally are nausea, vomiting, and a dry mouth. I'll take a note of that. Now, maybe let's move on to antacids. Ant refers to anti or against. The root word acid refers to substances with a pH level below 7. So the word antacids refer to drugs that increase the pH of the stomach in case the stomach pH level goes below the optimal gastric acid pH level, which can cause problems such as heartburn. Hence, antacids are often basic in nature or have a pH above 7, such as metal hydroxides like aluminum-hydroxide or magnesium hydroxide. So, what do antacids treat? How does it work? I've heard of the antacid drug that contains simethicone, aluminum hydroxide, and magnesium hydroxide. Could you possibly talk more about it? As I said earlier, antacids help treat conditions such as heartburn and acid reflux caused by the gastric acid pH levels going below the optimal pH level. Antacids are basic, which increases the pH level of the gastric acid, almost like in the process of a neutralization reaction, but not to excess such that the stomach gastric pH level is still acidic. Aluminum hydroxide and magnesium hydroxide are metal hydroxides, which are basic, so pH above 7. Simethicone, meanwhile, is actually an anti-foaming agent, which is used to reduce the stomach gas, which is made of carbon dioxide as well as other gases. Aluminum hydroxide has a pH level between 9 and 10. Its adverse effects include constipation. Magnesium hydroxide has a pH level between 9.5 and 10.5 and has laxative properties. Its adverse effects include a buildup of carbon dioxide gas, in which simethicone reduces. Hence, they are synergistic as each agent cooperates with each other, as magnesium hydroxide relieves the constipation effects of aluminum hydroxide and simethicone reduces the bloating or gaseous effect caused by magnesium hydroxide. That's really interesting, Dr. Jed. That's really cool. It's almost genius, the idea of creating a drug with synergistic agents. I'm astounded. It's very interesting, isn't it? Whilst talking about simethicone earlier, let me teach you more about anti-foaming agents. Oh, I can't wait for you to talk more about simethicone. Very well. So what is simethicone? Simethicone is an anti-foaming agent which basically removes foam. Just picture the foam created by carbon dioxide gas when you pour a can of soda. An excess of gases in our gastrointestinal tract are reasons behind things like burping, flatulence, and bloating. Simethicone reduces the amount of gas buildup in our gastrointestinal tract by forming larger masses of gas, or as they coalesce, which aids with the diffusion of gases, as now gases diffuse as larger molecules. Right. Now, I'm really curious about antiemetics, or the drugs that help relieve the symptoms of nausea and vomiting. Care to discuss it? No problem, David. Now, we shall talk about diphenhydramine and ondansetron. I'll briefly touch on diphenhydramine and then talk about ondansetron in more detail, because we have talked about diphenhydramine in our meetup on antihistamines. Diphenhydramine has sedative effects on the central nervous system, hence it can relieve nausea/vomiting caused by motion sickness. Its sedative effects reduce the sensory effects. Now, I want you to also remember that nausea and or vomiting are not always caused by gastrointestinal problems, but are also from vestibular, which is the vestibules in your inner ear, and neurological conditions too, such as vertigo, or intracranial or into the skull pressure. Chemotherapy can also cause nausea or vomiting too. So now let's talk about ondansetron. Ondansetron causes nausea and or vomiting. It inhibits or stops the effect of HT3 receptors, which are responsible for transferring information through the nervous system to the digestive tract, which affects and controls peristalsis, which is the movement of the esophagus ring muscles, and bowel movements. Cool, that's very cool. Now, what about its side effects? A few side effects of ondansetron include a headache and a flushed face. And I guess that's all for today. It was so nice seeing you. See you next week. Right, see ya!